infrastructure investments to address our energy sector, public lands, and Western water needs. While we'll be focusing our discussion today on our jurisdiction, let me begin by noting that infrastructure, broadly speaking, is truly a bipartisan issue that serves as the backbone of society. And it is critical at this time in our history that we come together to invest in our country in ways that are both fiscally responsible and reflect the needs of our nation. With the right strategy, reinvesting in our nation's infrastructure can also strengthen the economy, create jobs, boost our competitiveness, and help tackle climate change. Although I don't anticipate we will all agree on the size or scope of investment necessary to do this, I think all of my colleagues will agree that the areas within our jurisdiction are an important piece of the broader conversation about our infrastructure needs. Let me turn now to the draft legislation before us and the areas in which it invests. First off, the bill funds a demonstration and pilot projects included in the Bipartisan Energy Act in all of the above way, with billions of dollars for advanced nuclear, carbon capture, direct air capture, renewables, energy storage, and for industrial emissions solutions. You've all heard me say time and time again, we need to address climate change through innovation, not elimination, and that's what this legislation would do. That includes going after the low-hanging fruit, like energy efficiency, and doing what we can to reduce energy use in our residential, commercial, and industrial buildings. This not only results in real emission reductions, but it also saves people money. The text also builds on the complements the Energy Act by investing in CO2 infrastructure that will be needed to make CCUS and direct air capture a reality in the way we need it to be. It would invest in technologies that have low or no emissions, including supporting our existing zero-emission nuclear fleet and advancing hydrogen technologies that can significantly decarbonize our energy, industrial, and transportation sectors without relying on foreign supply chains. It would also build out supply chains that are needed for clean energy technologies, including making it easier to responsibly mine critical minerals and investing in domestic refining capabilities, in addition to onshoring battery manufacturing and recycling. We currently rely on other countries for each piece of that supply chain, some with questionable mining practices, and that's just not right. This legislation would also invest heavily in our electrical grid to improve the resilience, flexibility, and security of our energy infrastructure. We've seen across the country time and time again that the grid is not as resilient as we need it to be, from extreme weather events, wildlife, and cyber attacks. On the theme of resilience, this legislation would also make substantial, targeted investments to restore the health of our forest and mitigate the wildfires that have been impacting many of the communities in our western states. It also includes significant investments into legacy cleanup efforts to address issues with abandoned energy infrastructure that powered our country to greatness. That includes plugging orphan wells, which not only puts people to work, but also curbs methane emissions, which are 84% more potent than CO2 in the first 2 decades. It also includes investing in the reclamation of abandoned mine lands. Our coal communities bear the scars of having mined the coal to power this country to greatness over the last century. While this funding will do a great deal of good, it will still not be enough to cover all of the outstanding reclamation work that is desperately needed to finish the job and protect the health and safety of these communities in many cases and provide new economic opportunities for these areas. So I will be continuing to work with my colleagues to complement this funding with an extension of the AML reclamation fee that is set to expire in September, and inaction is truly not an option. These are just a few of the highlights for all the infrastructure investments the bill contemplates. This almost $95 billion investment would deliver on the President's American Jobs Plan in many big ways that can garner bipartisan support. I look forward to discussing these proposals and the needs they address with our panel today. I look forward to discussing these proposals. And with that, I turn to my friend and ranking member, Senator Barrasso, for his opening remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your commitment to develop bipartisan infrastructure legislation. We're very grateful. It is critical that this committee and the Senate as a whole proceed through regular order, not the partisan reconciliation process. I commend you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing to begin a regular order legislative process on infrastructure legislation. I applaud you also for drafting a bill that recognizes the necessity for advanced nuclear and carbon capture technologies. I am also grateful that the legislation includes money for water infrastructure in the West. If any projects within this committee's jurisdiction meet the definition of infrastructure, they are clearly Bureau of Reclamation projects. At the same time, Mr. Chairman, it is difficult to understand the rationale behind the lack of process used to draft the legislative proposal before us today. We all recognize the need to move infrastructure legislation in a timely manner. Neither I nor my staff had the opportunity to review or provide input on the draft bill before it was released last Thursday. It's also true for most of the Republican members of this committee. So I believe we should work to build a broad consensus. The lack of consultation means we're not including the priorities for all of the committee members who represent the states with different needs. There's a time to right the ship, to build this consensus, and to pass something that we can all support. So I'm ready to work with you, Mr. Chairman, to do just that. I believe the draft bill still needs work. It does not authorize programs where we should, and it does appropriate money where we should not. The Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee is, after all, a committee that authorizes programs. It doesn't appropriate funds, and I'm aware of no precedent where this committee appropriated anything close to $100 billion included in this draft bill. I'm troubled that the bill includes $5 billion for a program that appears designed to further bail out the state of California and its failing electric grid. The state of California already has a $75 billion budget surplus. I'm concerned that the bill funds the Department of Energy to coerce states to adopt building codes which may restrict the use of natural gas. I'm opposed to spending $500 million for schools to plant outdoor gardens and install green roofs. I'm concerned about appropriating 10 times the amount of money that Congress has authorized for weatherization assistance. I'm opposed to a 20-fold increase for an energy efficiency program and concerned that this bill includes almost no permitting reform. Permitting reform is one thing that we really need to actually get infrastructure built. The draft also leaves open critical questions. How will we pay for this bill? Will the bill be incorporated into Majority Leader Schumer's partisan reconciliation process, or will it go by regular order? Is this bill a wise and prudent use of American taxpayer dollars, or does it spend money on initiatives which the private sector already intends to support? Now, I, along with all the Republicans on this committee, are ready to get to work, Mr. Chairman. We have policy ideas and legislation that address America's infrastructure needs. We also need answers to our questions and changes to address our concerns. I want to again thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing and for beginning this committee process on this very important topic. I also want to welcome the witnesses to the committee today and look forward to the testimony from all of you.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. And I'd like to welcome all of our witnesses to the committee and thank you for being part of the important discussion today. Today we have with us Dr. Kathleen Hogan, Acting Undersecretary for Science and Energy at the Department of Energy, Ms. Tanya Trujillo, Assistant Secretary of Interior for Water and Science at the Department of Interior. Did I get that right? Good. Mr. Chris French, Deputy Chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Mr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, the President of American Action Forum, Mr. Colin O'Mara, the President and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, and finally, Mr. Mark Mills, a Senior Fellow with the Manhattan Institute. Before we get started with you, Dr. Hogan, I have Senator Wyden, who has another chairman, a very important committee that he has to run to real quick.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your thoughtfulness, and Senator Barrasso as well. I pledge to make this a filibuster-free zone, and I will take just one minute to be very brief. Mr. Chairman, I want it understood that I think you have put out a laudable product here, and I'm not saying this just because you included 3 of my pieces of legislation. I do want everyone to know, and I see my Western colleagues, with us, that every living soul in the West is collectively holding their breath right now for the next devastating wildfire to hit. And people sure have reasons to worry. Parts of my state are already on fire because of the record-breaking heat and severe drought conditions, and it is still only June. So, Chairman Manchin, your hearing on energy infrastructure could not be more timely. And obviously, we're working in several areas with respect to infrastructure to implement the President's Build Back Better agenda. There's an urgent need to address this climate crisis and invest in clean, renewable energy. And the 3 bills that I'd like to put additional supplemental material into the record on, or the Disaster Safe Power Act, and the prescribed fire legislation, and additional language with respect to the Forest Service Legacy Roads and Trails program. We are going to need, in my view, increased funding above what is in this proposal, but I think we all know that we have to work on these issues in the way this committee has always focused, which is to do it in a bipartisan way. I thank the chairman for the chance to take this minute and the indulgence of particularly my Western colleagues, because I think it would be fair to say, for purposes of the record, we are very much like-minded on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator White. And also, we have Senator Cantwell basically has to go to her Commerce Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So appreciate the indulgence. I hope to come back much later, obviously, in this process, but I just wanted to thank you for your draft legislation, so important to the very important needs to ensure electricity prices remain affordable, harden our grid against increasing intense and extreme weather, and the importance of cybersecurity, as well as the competitiveness to manufacturers to export great products around the world. Temperatures in Washington State are going to reach a record high next week and this weekend, and so I think that these debilitating highs that impact so much of our Western economy now need to be dealt with. The fact that, Mr. Chairman, you incorporated several provisions on the Grid Modernization and Expansion Act, very important legislation, and I hope that this 21st century grid is smarter, more resilient, more reliable, and more affordable. So thank you for including those provisions, and I appreciate your leadership.
Thank you, Senator. Is there anyone else in the committee that wants to make a quick statement before we go to the witnesses? If not, thank you all. Now we will start with Dr. Hogan.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Department of Energy on the role of energy infrastructure in achieving the Biden-Harris administration clean energy and job goals and our initial evaluation of the infrastructure discussion draft. Affordable, clean, reliable, and secure energy is essential to a prosperous America. And DOE is already jump-starting efforts to improve our energy infrastructure and create jobs, enhance national security, and transition to the clean energy economy of the future. And we're prioritizing the communities who have been left behind. We've set ambitious new goals to cut solar costs, add new gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, and reduce the cost of clean hydrogen. And with other agencies, we have identified nearly $38 billion in existing federal resources to help the hardest hit communities as they shift their reliance on fossil fuels. And we're leading an interagency working group on coal and power plant communities to promote investments in such communities. So this discussion draft of the committee will help us do more. But today's challenge will not be met without the scale and scope of the American Jobs Plan. President Biden released the American Jobs Plan in March. It is the biggest investment in America since World War II, positions the U.S. to win the global energy market, will put millions of Americans to work, and lays the foundation for economic growth for decades to come. The plan recognizes the urgency to act, and that it goes beyond addressing critical infrastructure and requires addressing head-on the challenges posed to our security and our economy by the climate crisis. It proposes investments in clean energy research, a full range of demonstration projects. It would deploy technologies to deliver clean, affordable energy to every community and invest in factories to propel U.S. leadership in clean energy manufacturing, providing good-paying jobs. We see this discussion draft as inspired in part by the American Jobs Plan and advancing the recent Energy Act of 2020. I will speak to some expanded DOE capabilities, as well as some areas where greater authority and funding would be beneficial. First, the discussion draft, building on the Energy Act of 2020, appropriates important funding towards key research facilities and demonstrations, including, and as you mentioned, energy storage, advanced nuclear, renewable energy, critical minerals, and industrial decarbonization. And it includes additional efforts on carbon capture, hydrogen, carbon transportation and storage, grid resilience, and cybersecurity, all elements of the American Jobs Plan. And it broadens key DOE capabilities with the existing nuclear fleet, the Loan Guarantee Program, and upgrading our nation's electricity transmission system, largely consistent with the President's vision for a grid deployment authority at the Department of Energy. And it helps lower utility costs for schools, federal facilities, low-income homes, and other buildings and facilities. That said, additional capabilities, flexibilities, and funding, as outlined in the American Jobs Plan, are needed. For example, more flexible and larger state, tribal, and local grants to advance clean energy throughout the country, greater supply chain investment beyond the batteries and critical minerals sphere, and more resources to help retool existing factories and transition workers. Additional transmission-related provisions so DOE can support states and utilities as they plan, permit, and pay for hardened, expanded, and modernized transmission systems. Additional scope for DOE's loan program and additional funding to allow use of the broadened scope, and a clean energy standard to leverage private sector investment, yield locally tailored energy mixes, and offering another way to provide incentives for nuclear power as you envision. So we do have before us a generational opportunity to invest in our future, capitalize on an emerging $23 trillion global clean energy market, and create millions of good-paying careers that, while making our electricity grid, our homes, and our communities safer, cleaner, and more resilient. So again, the committee's infrastructure discussion draft is an important step, but this generational opportunity to build back better requires the American Jobs Plan. We look forward to working with you throughout the legislative process and here to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hogan. Next, we're going to have Ms. Trujillo.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. Thank you for providing the Department of the Interior with the opportunity to testify on the discussion draft of the Energy Infrastructure Act. In addition to my testimony today, Interior will be happy to provide the committee with additional views and assistance as the bill moves forward. We are very happy to be working closely with our colleagues at the Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture on these important programs. Many of the provisions in the draft bill complement the administration's American Jobs Plan and fit well within the Department of the Interior's priority goals. Addressing the challenges of climate change and America's aging infrastructure are priorities for the department as we continue to invest in measures to increase climate resilience and manage our public lands for the benefit of the American people. In my role at Interior, I work closely with the Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Geological Survey, but all parts of the department are united in tackling these important challenges. Faced with unprecedented drought and record-setting temperatures, Interior is working closely with our sister agencies and with state and local entities to provide assistance to farmers, tribes, and other water users to help respond to the severe drought conditions we are facing. Providing additional capabilities to respond to drought and meet water supply needs are some of the many examples in the draft bill that are complementary to the administration's proposals in the American Jobs Plan and to our ongoing work at Interior. For example, the provisions in Title II, with respect to the provisions in Title II, we are utilizing the best available science to help ensure that we can meet the administration's recently announced goals to strengthen American supply chains and to promote economic security, national security, and good-paying union jobs here at home. With respect to critical minerals, the USGS is responsible for mapping, characterizing, and quantifying the nation's geologic resources, including critical minerals. The department will work very closely with other federal agencies, tribal nations, and state and local entities to ensure we can meet the goals for sustainable production, refining, and recycling capabilities for critical minerals here at home through environmentally responsible, appropriately sited critical mineral production from our public lands. We look forward to working with this committee to achieve those goals. In Section 6001, relating to orphaned wells, that section establishes a program to plug, remediate, and reclaim orphaned wells through grants to states and new programs for tribes and federal lands. The department recently testified before this committee in strong support of those sections' goals and for remediating the thousands of orphaned oil and gas wells on federal and non-federal lands. Those wells and abandoned mines pose serious safety hazards while also causing ongoing air, water, and other environmental damage. Reclamation of orphaned wells helps to ensure that any impacts on the land and resources are not permanent, and the additional reclamation creates jobs. Section 7001 would provide additional funding for the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Fund to address legacy abandoned coal mine sites throughout the nation. The administration supports reauthorization of the Abandoned Mine Land Fee Authority before its expiration on September 30th in order to continue this important work. Title 8 of the draft bill highlights the magnitude of this year's severe heat and drought to emphasize the need to improve our wildfire management capabilities before, during, and after the fires occur. We agree with the draft bill's provisions that there is an urgent need to focus equally on wildfire prevention and mitigation efforts while continuing to carry out our core wildfire response activities. With respect to Western water provisions, as I mentioned earlier, the department recognizes the drought impacts facing the West. I work on them every day, and drought resilience projects, water efficiency projects, and other water management improvements provide critical support for our communities and stakeholders as they continue to prepare to respond to the drought. We would also like to see the addition of additional provisions relating to other priorities such as Indian water rights settlements, rural water projects, and critical dam safety improvements. Thank you for the opportunity to present the department's views on this discussion draft. The President has made clear that this is a top priority, and we welcome the opportunity to work with the committee. This concludes my statement, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. French?
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The Energy Infrastructure Act discussion draft before us recognizes key investments critical to the USDA Forest Service and highlights areas detailed in the President's American Job Plan. It offers thoughtful solutions to many of the issues our agency currently faces. First and foremost, our greatest challenge is to address the wildfire crisis occurring throughout the nation. We must address it at the scale of the problem and bring long-term relief to our firefighters, our communities, and our forests. I'm happy to see that the discussion draft addresses this crisis on several fronts. As you know, last year was one of the most devastating fire seasons on record. There were too many lives lost, more than 10 million acres burned, and more than 17,000 structures lost. We find ourselves facing another challenging year. Drought conditions exist in much of the West, and we're seeing record high temperatures. With more than 29,000 fires that have occurred so far this year, we've already raised our national preparedness level to level 4, a level that we have not been in this early in the season since 2002. We've already deployed more interagency resources and are experiencing more fires than we did at this same point last year. Again, we have a crisis. To that end, the discussion draft recognizes the need to increase, recruit, retain, and compensate a professional federal firefighting workforce. It recognizes the need to make key investments in technology, predictive services, and state and local firefighting partners. And most imperative, it recognizes the need to reduce the risk of wildfires through restoring our forested landscapes through a variety of federal and state-based programs. As the draft recognizes, federal firefighters need to be properly compensated for their work and the risks they take. Federal wages for firefighters have not kept pace with wages offered by state, local, and private entities in many areas in the United States. I know this firsthand. Early in my career, I started as a GS4 temporary firefighter. In 1992, I made $7.60 an hour. 30 years later, that starting pay is $11.60 an hour, an increase of only $4. It's not enough for us to be competitive, to recruit and retain the firefighters, nor does it recognize the risk of the work they do. So we share the committee's concerns about the competitive pay and are engaging with the wildland firefighter community. and the Office of Personnel Management to find solutions. I look forward to working with you on this important issue. Next, the Forest Service carries out nearly 3 million acres of wildland fire treatments a year, but it's not nearly enough. To really make progress, our scientists show us that we need to accomplish 2 to 4 times these treatments per year, but they have to be in the right places, where the outcomes of those treatments reduce the risk to our communities. In many cases, these are not the easiest and the cheapest acres to treat, but they are the right acres. President Biden's American Jobs Plan, through initiatives such as the Civilian Climate Corps, calls for restoring nature-based infrastructure to increase resilience and reduce the risks associated with extreme wildfires. We believe the investments in wildfire risk reduction in Title VIII will make a significant start to reducing the threat of wildland fire communities across the West. We also appreciate the provisions that invest in ecosystem restoration. We have a lot of work to do in our post-fire restoration needs. For example, wildfires right now create 80% of our reforestation needs, and the Forest Service is only able to keep up with about 6% of that. We have a rapidly increasing reforestation backlog. Provisions in Title VIII that address restoration activities, post-wildfire, invasive species, and stream restorations will help us accommodate critical work that often goes undone. It's also important that we remediate National Forest System land significantly impacted by past use. The Forest Service has inherited more than 11,000 orphan oil and gas wells, and we appreciate the committee's attention to this important issue and support the goal of Section 6001. Finally, this past year, we saw 168 million users on our national forests, a new record and an increase of nearly 18 million people. We know that national forests and grasslands provide restorative experiences and natural connections that people needed during the pandemic. The Great American Outdoors Act addresses about 20% of our deferred recreation maintenance, but there's a need to provide facilities and services that matches the surge in visitor demand and that reduce barriers for communities that are not served by our current infrastructure. I appreciate that Title VIII includes acknowledgement of and some additional funding for recreation sites experiencing use beyond their carrying capacity. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. And Dr. Eakin.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss this important and very timely issue. I think I'd like to make 3 brief points, and then I'd look forward to answering your questions. The first is that Congress and this committee have the opportunity to do something very important by investing in productivity and long-term growth in the United States. The administration's budget, which is more optimistic than the CBO, shows long-term growth at 2% or a little bit below. Investing in core productive infrastructure of the type contemplated by this committee is a way to raise that productivity growth and benefit Americans in all walks of life. It's the most important single economic indicator over the long term. The composition of the spending is the key there. This has to be things that raise productivity, and so even though there are going to be other demands for taxpayer dollars, focusing on those core infrastructure areas and avoiding spending money on things which will not raise productivity is probably a key design issue for this committee and for the Congress. Second thing is that it can do that without exacerbating the risk of higher inflation that we're experiencing right now. This spending would be very different than that in, for example, the American Rescue Plan, which is one of the things that has fueled the rising inflation. We've seen in the first half of 2021 an increase in inflation across the board. We saw the highest core CPI since June of 1992 in the May statistics. We see supply chain price increases. We see producer price increases. Asset prices have been extremely high and volatile. All of this is a tribute to the kind of overstimulus that came from the front-loaded $1.9 trillion that we saw in the ARP. This committee and the Congress can backload this plan and pay for it in its entirety, avoiding the inflationary risks, but at the same time supplementing the pace of long-term economic growth. And that, I think, would be a tremendous design opportunity for the committee and for the Congress, and I encourage you to take advantage of it. Third point I'd like to make about the programs that are in the jurisdiction of this committee is that investment in energy infrastructure is what the private sector does. Over the past 10 years, if you look at Department of Energy and other government programs, they spent about $30 billion on investments in energy. In 2020, hardly a banner year for the U.S. economy and for investment, the private sector invested $85 billion in clean energy efforts. So in thinking about your policy goals, remember, it is the private sector that is going to provide the money, whether it's done through paying taxes, buying the bonds that the Treasury tries to sell, or investing their own dollars. And giving them appropriate incentives is what the market has done. We've seen the market apply profits tests to different projects and reward innovation in clean energy. That is at the heart of being successful in addressing the climate goals that the nation has set out. And so I would encourage you to take advantage of the private sector in the design, to use it for project selection and innovation, and to allow the economy to continue to innovate and grow more rapidly. That would meet all of the tests of improving the long-term outlook for economic growth, improving the long-term outlook for the planet and the climate, and avoiding near-term risks of inflation, which could be damaging to fixed-income seniors and low-income Americans. I thank you for the chance to discuss this today.
Thank you. Now, Mr. O'Mara.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin. Good to see you, Senator Barrasso, and members of the committee. I can't think of a better committee to be having this conversation with than the committee that last year in the previous Congress it managed to pass the Great American Outdoors Act, the Public Lands Package, as well as the Energy Act of 2020. And the work that this committee did over those 2 years has laid the foundation for so many of the items that you're proposing for investment today. And so I just want to thank you for the great bipartisan leadership that we see in this committee. Now, the time in which we're talking about these investments, coming back to where Senator Wyden started just a few minutes ago, the landscape's rough right now. You know, we're looking at wildfires, at least 39 major fires across the country, already at 500,000 acres burned across the West, 40 million acres burned over the last 5 years. And that's on top of the challenge we're having with drought conditions that are at record levels all over the West, as well as an above-average hurricane season that we're anticipating on the East. And so to have an infrastructure package that is so well climate-informed is truly historic. And I'm greatly appreciative of all the language in this bill. It does conform in great ways with the American Jobs Plan that President Biden put out, but also showing that some of these investments are bipartisan. And so I just want to use my few minutes today to highlight 5 areas that I think are important to keep in the package, maybe a few ideas for tweaks and improvements. But again, just thanking all of you for coming together to show that we can work across the aisle on these important issues to both advance our climate goals and our economic competitiveness and productivity goals. In the energy innovation and industrial sector, thank you for including the level of funding that you're proposing, particularly for carbon capture and sequestration, the nuclear investments. We do think there's opportunities to go bigger on the renewable side and the energy efficiency side. But again, these are wildly popular proposals. 75% of the American people support energy innovation, deployment of these technologies. And so we would encourage you to plus up Title 10. I think there's more opportunities to reduce criteria pollution in the carbon capture space, and something we'd like to work with you on because there are concerns about the pollution that comes from some of these technologies. The technology is actually showing that you achieve significant reductions in sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and mercury as you're applying these technologies, not so much on NOx, but it's an area for potential bipartisan work to make sure those technologies are both capturing carbon as well as other pollutants. We're incredibly excited about Chairman Manchin's leadership on abandoned mines and orphan wells. Also working closely with folks like Senator Kramer, Senator Lujan, so many others, Senator Hoeven, Senator Heinrich, on cleaning up our mines and wells. The funding levels are fantastic. Proposing them at the same level the American Jobs Plan is a great start. We strongly support Senator Manchin's call for AML reauthorization, an incredibly important program because, as the chairman said, $11 billion, as big of a number as that is, it's not going to clear the backlog. We have much more there. The $4.7 billion proposed for orphan wells, again, a great start, but we have tens of billions of dollars of need there. We'd also encourage the committee to look at that hard rock cleanup costs as well as uranium mining, abandoned uranium mines. That backlog is just getting bigger and bigger. We need to look at 1872 as part of the conversation, but this is a huge opportunity to make a down payment and, frankly, put people to work in the places where we need them most right now. I'd also encourage the committee to complement this conversation with conversations around 1872 and General Mining Act, as well as oil and gas bonding requirements, so we're not in the same mess 20 years from now as additional wells and mines go offline and require cleanup, so we don't wind up in the same place again. The third place is on the forestry piece, and kind of picking up on my friend Chris's comments. It's fantastic that the forestry language is in here, the fire language, the ecological restoration. It's not nearly enough. We estimate we need almost $60 billion investment in our forest service, in our forests over the next 5 years. At least $33 billion of that should go to the Forest Service, probably $6 billion towards BLM. And we also need a lot more resources for the Bureau of Land Management. We estimate more than $6 billion of need for the Bureau of Land Management. A lot of the fires that are starting right now are not starting in our forests, it's starting in our grasses. It's our buffalo grass, it's our cheatgrasses, these invasive grasses that are growing like crazy when it's wet, and then all of a sudden when the drought comes, all of a sudden they're tinder for everything. A huge opportunity to put people to work and frankly protect a lot of other assets and communities. Two last quick ones on critical minerals. We are really excited we're having a serious conversation. The idea of having a supply chain that is controlled by the Chinese or the Dominican or in Congo or other places is unacceptable. We want to do it safely. We want to make sure that we're recycling more, and we appreciate Senator King's leadership on recycling. We think there's a big opportunity there. We also think there's some places we should protect. And again, there's some language around 1872. And also just very supportive of the language around transmission and carbon pipelines. Some of the most innovative parts of this package are in the transmission space. We strongly encourage you to keep them. We appreciate Senator Heinrich's leadership, Senator Cantwell's leadership, but the things around regionalism, around regional planning, loan authority, bolstering the authorities, absolutely important work. And finally, in my last few seconds, we would encourage this committee to continue working with other committees on things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Clean Energy Standard, working lands, and the clean energy tax credits. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back my 1 second.
You did good, Colin. Mr. Mills.
Hard act to follow. Thank you. Good morning.
You got 7 minutes in and 4:59.
Chairman Manchin. Ranking Member Barrasso, this hearing is focused on draft legislation regarding the infrastructure implications of shifting the nation's energy supply towards lower carbon systems. So I think it's prudent to consider the full range of options, especially those that could be implemented rapidly and cost effectively. But first, permit me to offer a global context because this is, after all, a global issue. The International Energy Agency's latest roadmap to net zero proposes a 1,200% increase in the global production from wind and solar in just 20 years. It took the global oil industry, for context, 50 years to expand that much in energy equivalent terms. Thus, the net zero roadmap that everyone's chasing expects a twofold faster growth rate in physical infrastructures of energy machines, and one that will require using 1,000% more materials to build. The latter is the physical reality of building wind and solar technology. It is, to paraphrase, not a feature and a bug, it's both a feature and a bug. This is a kind of scale and velocity for infrastructure expansion that is truly breathtaking, and frankly, I have to go on record as saying I don't think it's actually possible. But in the spirit of seeking means to reduce global hydrocarbon use, one might consider 5 energy options that don't appear to be on the currently favored roadmap. So first, greater, faster, and more certain reductions in carbon dioxide emissions would happen if the U.S. ensured liquid natural gas exports increased as much in the future as has already happened. If it were not for the epic increase in global natural gas supply and the drop in prices that occurred at the same time, the world today would be burning about 2 billion tons more coal per year. That dynamic was driven in large part by the American production, wherein Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, for the record, collectively accounted for nearly 2/3 of that domestic expansion. America's Appalachian region is one of the world's biggest producers of natural gas and could be far bigger yet. No incentives are needed to get America's gas producers to supply more. The key to facilitating more exports rests in the infrastructures of pipelines and ports, where Congress certainly can play a constructive role. A second obvious low-carbon energy option would be to accelerate next-generation nuclear energy deployment, which is profoundly superior in physical infrastructure terms. The energy in a pound of nuclear fuel matches 60,000 pounds of oil or 100,000 pounds of coal or 1 million pounds of Tesla-class batteries. The impediments to grid-scale nuclear power have been well documented, and as this committee well knows. There are exciting options now in the form of mini reactors that could power even small cities or small towns. A key to unlocking this technology is commercial validation and production scaling. We could consider converting a large share of the federal government's electric supply to microgrids powered by mini reactors, possibly focused on military bases. A program could be modeled on the military's competitive procurement process, wherein 1 or 2 winners are awarded multi-billion-dollar, multi-year production contracts. A third option for reducing oil use is simple, even if it's unpopular: encourage greater use of next-generation internal combustion engines. The world will have hundreds of millions of conventional cars for decades to come, even in the most optimistic electric vehicle scenarios. The advanced combustion engines could yield more oil savings over the coming decade than the expansion of electric vehicles. New super-efficient designs for internal combustion engines already exist. Some have as few moving parts as an electric motor. Federal assistance could be useful here, particularly the DOE's Advanced Manufacturing Program. A fourth action to consider is in the domain where I've earlier testified, which is increasing the use of wind, solar, and batteries increases the imports of critical minerals and materials. This is a critical area, and decades of bipartisan proposals have all reached the same obvious conclusion. Decreasing import dependencies requires increasing domestic mining. Any path to net zero passes directly through critical infrastructures of mining and minerals processing. Finally, a fifth policy action we should consider, it doesn't seem to be on the table at a fulsome level, is pursuit of lower carbon energy technologies will require capabilities and technologies that are often deemed critical but don't exist. This is something both the IEA and Microsoft, for example, have acknowledged. Truly radical innovations and inventions will need new science that can only be addressed through foundational discoveries in physics and chemistry and biology. It's again a domain where Congress can play a role. So in summary, given the $100 billion in change of spending being contemplated in the legislation under consideration, the scale and the long lead times inherent in civilization's energy infrastructures requires a long-term vision. And I think it calls for caution to avoid launching short-term initiatives that not only would fail to achieve stated goals, but could damage the U.S. economy and geopolitical stature. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mills, and thank all of you. Now we'll start the questions. And my first question will go to Dr. Hogan. And Dr. Hogan, the IEA, International Energy Agency, has recently found that one of the most cost-effective options available to reduce emissions, maintaining reliability, was to ensure continued long-term operation of nuclear power plants. As you know, one reactor has been shut down in New York, 4 are on the chopping block in Illinois, and we have a goal by 2035 to be net zero. Is that possible without nuclear staying online? And do you think the only way to meet that is going to be reducing fossil altogether or finding technologies that will help make it cleaner? Just talk. We'll tell you if it's on or not.
Thank you. The Department of Energy is very supportive of maintaining the existing fleet of nuclear power plants for many of the reasons that you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And maintaining that fleet has been part of the nuclear energy program mission and for many years. And we certainly are interested in the additional provisions that you've provided in this infrastructure draft.
That would help with the financing to keep them competitive so they'll stay open?
Exactly.
Can you save the 4 in Illinois? As they put a moratorium on closing, can you save the 4 nuclears in Illinois?
We can certainly look at anything we can do based on the ability that you give us to take a look.
Sure. I've sent the president a letter basically asking him to intervene. This moratorium on closing anymore. And also on your answer on the fossil fuels. Elimination or basically innovation?
We are all about innovation, and certainly we know there's a number of ways to reduce the environmental impacts of fossil fuels. That also you are calling out important investments in this discussion draft that we find very promising.
Mr. Hio, the Department of Interior estimates the cost to complete the AML reclamation work is $10.6. According to recent reports of Ohio River Valley Institute, there could be as much as 18 to 20 billion in unfunded reclamation across the U.S. That's roughly 84% of remaining damage is concentrated in Appalachia states, which is no surprise. West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, Alabama, Virginia, and Tennessee. Can you explain the discrepancy in these figures, 10, what you all come up with, 10 versus 18, with the Ohio River Valley Institute? Why there's such a disparity?
Thank you, Senator Manchin. I would have to consult with some experts on the exact rationale, but I know there are a number of different inputs that are coming in. We're receiving information from states, from other agencies, and trying to work to incorporate that information. What we know is the number is very large, and we have to take action to try to address the concerns.
At the beginning of the 21st century, most of our energy for fossil came from that region, and that's why we have so many properties that need to be attended to. To Dr. Egan, it's clear clean energy technologies will require more mineral resources, but some projections falsely claim that we will run out of these critical minerals, let alone being able to get a permit to even get them out of the ground of what we need. So a foreign supply chain is what we're depending on right now, and willing to change our whole transportation mode based on foreign supply chains. What's your thoughts on that, and how do you expect us to be able to meet market demands? Or I'm understanding the demand's going to grow by over 70 times in the very near future.
Well, I think what we heard is that the expectation is enormous demands for electric vehicles, for solar panels, for all sorts of things that require critical minerals. The only way to do that and not rely on the Congo and China is to have domestic supplies. And that means public policies that permit those to be safely mined in the U.S. and processed in the United States. And we're behind the curve on doing that.
How do you look at other energy sources such as hydrogen, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, that basically would provide us a carbon-free energy? Should we be going down that path too, or dual path, or basically that doesn't require foreign supply chains?
I don't see any reason why we should be picking among fuel sources and energy sources. We should be trying to develop those which are cost-effective and thus meet market tests, and which deliver energy in a reliable fashion.
Can be supplied basically by a U.S. Without supply chains, foreign supply chains.
Yeah, I think.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I think the general, what I would emphasize is, U.S. energy policy has been most successful when it's been good economic policy, when it has provided adequate market incentives, and we should continue to do that.
Mr. Mills.
The challenge with the hydrogen as an energy source is obvious. It's a carrier like electricity, has to be produced from something. Proposals to make hydrogen by using, let's say, wind turbines and solar arrays increase the foreign mineral dependencies, they don't decrease it. If you make hydrogen from natural gas, which is how almost all of it is produced today, you eliminate foreign mineral dependencies.
Thank you. Call them real quick.
The only thing I would add is that right now we recycle less than 1% of rare earth minerals, and the numbers are equally bad for the critical mineral list that in the last administration, this administration put together. We talked a lot about lithium recycling. We need to talk about all of it, because if we do that together, we can actually meet a lot of our domestic needs.
So you say basically in recycling, we can put those back into productive use again?
Yeah, I mean, some elements degrade and some don't, right?
Sure.
But like, I mean, we're still only recycling a third to half of copper, right? I mean, so like we need to be much better as a country at this.
We know about recycling. Thank you very much. Senator Barrasso.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Holtz-Eakin, I want to follow up with you just said good energy policy is when it's good economic policy. Yes. So I have a couple short questions within the legislation before us today. Will funding energy efficiency programs at, say, 10 or 20 times their annual appropriated levels, will that help or hurt the U.S. economy?
That will hurt.
You want to explain exactly why that would be?
I'm deeply concerned about this notion of scaling up by multiples of 20 times and 30 times programs. We've seen this before, notably in the Recovery Act, where we did it, for example, in a broadband program. We got terrible results, wasted a lot of taxpayer money, and efficiency standards are a cost. We do it for their benefits, but if we don't get the benefits, then we've just imposed a cost on the economy.
Okay. So will buying electric transmission capacity, which the private sector is already prepared to purchase, will that help or hurt us, our U.S. economy?
That will hurt. It makes no sense to displace what the private sector is already doing.
How about closing roads and hiking trails and therefore limiting public access to our national forests? Will that help or hurt the U.S. economy? How about expanding Davis-Bacon? Will that help or hurt?
That will hurt.
So, Mr. Mills, the draft bill includes very little permitting reform. In your view, how urgent is it that Congress include meaningful permitting reform in the infrastructure bill? And then I'm going to ask you, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, if you concur.
Well, I think it's critical, but we can come back to the energy minerals and critical minerals issues, which are gratefully coming to the top of consideration. The average permitting time in the United States to open a mine is something on the order of 20 to 30 years. It's about half that in the world on average, and it's half that again in many jurisdictions. It's entirely a permitting issue and a regulatory issue. It is not because we don't have the resources or the technology.
And Dr. Holtz-Eakin?
I think it's very important. But we have some real insight into this from Congress's most recent surface transportation bill, where it got some information gathering requirements. And if you look at the monitor, the dashboard for that, it shows that the paperwork associated with the infrastructure financed by that that bill, the paperwork takes about 30 million hours annually and costs $2 billion to comply with. So there's a real permitting problem that needs to be addressed.
Mr. Mills, unlike roads and bridges, most energy infrastructure in the United States is privately owned and privately funded. In fact, even most of the publicly owned energy infrastructure is financed through bonds sold to private investors. Would passing this bill with close to $100 billion in direct federal spending, would that chase private investment out of the energy sector?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. And when the government does direct spending on projects, they do chase private investment out. That's well documented. The broader question is, how does the government spend money constructively to encourage private sector spending, to get leverage? That's the proverbial devil in the details, but as we go to one end of the spectrum, we do something that, to put it in unkind terms, we run the risk of Sovietizing our infrastructures.
Dr. Holtz-Egan?
That's my concern as well. One of the things you get is not just the adequate level of spending from the private sector, you get better project selection because you're picking the most productive and most efficient investments.
Let me follow up with in terms of as Congress is considering how to pay for the infrastructure bill, would the U.S. economy be better off if we use some of the unspent COVID stimulus funds rather than spend additional new money?
That would turn non-investment spending into investment spending, which is exactly what you need for growth.
So the infrastructure, the infrastructure proposal before us today, nearly $100 billion in direct spending. In the past, you've explained how expensive infrastructure bills, which are designed to stimulate the economy, often end up creating economic headwinds instead. Could you kind of expand on that for the committee?
My concern is that when you attach stimulus to infrastructure investments, you get the incentives wrong. That incentive is get the money out the door as fast as possible. That leads to excessive demand in the near term and inflationary pressures. We're seeing that right now from the recovery program, American Rescue Program, among other things. You also tend to run past the project selection criteria and invest it poorly, and that, as a result, has long-run headwinds in your productivity growth. And the combination is something that I think this committee and the Congress can avoid this time. There's plenty of stimulus out there. There's no need to worry about that. What we need to worry about is the quality of our investments in long-term productivity and the climate objectives of the nation.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Now, Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's helpful to take a step back and ask, why are we here? We're here because I have wildfires raging early and hard in New Mexico, and I thought it was hot because we've been in triple digits for a few weeks. But NASA satellites confirmed on June 20th that surface temperatures in Siberia, north of the Arctic Circle, were 118 degrees. Our forests cannot maintain themselves if we keep baking the planet like this. I want to thank you for the investments in this legislation in transmission, in hydrogen, in weatherization, in orphan wells, and in mine cleanup. I would suggest we need for the mine cleanup money to apply to hard rock as well. And I think we need to look hard at a clean energy standard to meet the scale of time that is necessary in this transition. I want to talk for a second about hard rock. We all acknowledge the need for critical minerals in these new technologies, but I will say our hard rock mining legislation framework was written in 1872, and we will produce a lot more critical minerals if we actually have safeguards for local water supplies, if we have robust public involvement, and if we clean up the hundreds of thousands of abandoned hard rock mines that litter the West. I first met former Governor John Hickenlooper on the phone because the Animas River and the San Juan River were running yellow because we didn't clean up that mess. And it makes it hard to get communities to embrace a mine if you haven't reformed that fundamental law. So 1872 Mining Act reform should be a prerequisite to give communities the confidence to actually mine these materials. Mr. O'Mara, I wish I could talk as fast as you. You indicated the need for an additional $6.5 billion for forest restoration, hazardous fuels management on BLM lands. another 6 for rangeland management, water resources, resilience, and research on BLM and tribal lands. Talk to us about the necessity of these efforts in order to break the current fire cycle, which is releasing carbon, and talk a little bit about the relationship to a potential 21st century CCC program that can help us scale up fast enough to actually turn this around.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Heinrich. And even on your previous comment, those abandoned mines could be a very rich source of the minerals that we need. So, I mean, the work that Senator Manchin,
Absolutely
yourself
right.
and Senator Murkowski have been doing, it's incredibly important to harvest what's still already in those mines. Look, I mean, just very honestly, right, we for decades have not invested in our Bureau of Land Management lands. And that the decades of disinvestment have led to invasive species on the vegetation side just running wild. I mean, we have 100 million acres right now of cheatgrass that's basically just tinder. And so we have a wet spring, got all the vegetation growing. We have a dry summer, huge heats. All of that becomes tinder. And whether it's the Great Basin or other places, it's not just public lands; it's private lands too. And there's some work we have to do on private grasslands. But the grasslands and shrublands are the rate of fire growth is some of the fastest in the country. And so we talk about fire as a forest problem, but we have to talk about shrublands and grasslands, and that's why having both investments on the wildfire side is important, but also making sure we're investing in the restoration, because it's also one of the best ways to prevent drought by having better storage naturally in the system, more storage in the headwaters, as a way to restore these systems and help downstream states like New Mexico.
And I would add that cheatgrass is not exactly forage for anything, right? It's not for livestock, it's not for wildlife. Dr. Hogan, if we were to simply, we talk a lot about innovation on this committee, but I like to talk about implementation on this committee. And if we were to simply electrify everything that we can today, all of the things that we could swap out in our homes and businesses where we have superior technology today, replacing gas furnaces, stoves, water heaters with electric heat pumps, with induction stoves, with air source heat pump water heaters. What kind of an emissions impact would we see if we did that throughout our economy?
I mean, certainly there's a number of great electric technologies out there, and we see them being adopted in different parts of the country at different rates. As we clean the grid, where you can get to with electrification and a cleaner grid from a CO2 standpoint, you can get to a close to zero carbon world from the energy that you use in the built infrastructure.
Thank you, Chairman.
With that, we have Senator Langford.
Chairman, thank you. Chairman, I also want to thank you that you include the Title 17 loan program changes that I've encouraged as part of the draft that's in this. Dr. Hogan, you also mentioned the importance of those program changes in some of your written statements. I appreciate that as well. We've got to get back to actually handling our critical minerals, as all of you, I think, have mentioned at some point, to figure out how we're going to actually get to them. Mr. Mills, I want to follow up on a statement that you just made, though. You made the statement it takes 20 to 30 years to open a mine at this point. Can you go into greater depth on that?
Well, I will confess that I look at an extraordinarily large body of research done by many agencies, both federal and state, on the challenge in opening mines in America. And I would, to some of the comments, the hazards of opening mines. Mining is difficult. I worked for a mining company in Canada early in my career. I've been at mine sites. I may be the only one in the room that has gone to the bottom of a 5,000-foot vertical hard rock shaft. I like mining. I know mining is hard. I know communities are challenged by the physical infrastructure. And I would say that the fact that the U.S. has seen the barriers in all the senses, not just public barriers, regulatory barriers, state, has chased mining out of the country fundamentally. I don't see any evidence that we're going to be able to change that in any of the proposals anywhere. I'm delighted that we're now paying attention to it. It's critical. We're enormously dependent on imports of critical minerals for all purposes, and the path of chasing wind, solar, and batteries will have an astonishing increase in mineral dependency imports, and the speed with which we'll increase the demand for these minerals is far faster, is astronomically faster than any proposals to do anything that's being discussed right now to open up U.S. mines. We will increase imports in the balance of trade deficit and depend on nations we don't like very much for a lot of minerals. That's just locked into these plans.
So the United States figured out pretty quickly during the beginning of the pandemic when the Communist Chinese government decided to hang on to PPE, that was American companies that were producing in China that were destined to be able to come to the United States, that from the earliest moments of the pandemic, we couldn't get PPE from American companies manufacturing in China. We learned pretty quickly that if they want it, they're going to keep it, and they're going to turn that on and off. They've used leverage already for rare earth minerals, rare earth elements, and critical minerals with Japan and others to be able to use leverage against them to be able to ship that out. You made a statement saying that if we transition to net zero emissions, we would need to increase minerals mining by 700 to 4,000%.
Yeah, that's correct. It's not my data. That's the IEA's data. Other studies, the UN studies, IRENA studies have all looked to these issues. The physical demand for not just rare earths, but for common minerals like copper and nickel are astronomically large. I completely endorse the need for creative, innovative ways to recycle these minerals. We under-recycle many relatively easy to recycle minerals like copper. But the irony here is the rate of velocity of increase in demand for the net zero path would overwhelm if we recycled 100% of the copper and nickel and manganese and cobalt that we now use. It wouldn't come close to supplying the needs for the growth paths that are being put in place.
So the Trans-West electric transmission lines, I've referenced in this committee before, moving power from the Northwest into Wyoming. That process of permitting started in 2007. They have yet to break ground on it. And that's an electric transmission line. So I come back to this issue to say, I really believe in this legislation, anything we talk about on increasing our capacity to go net zero, we have got to deal with the permitting issues. If we can't build a transmission line in 15 years, and we can't build or start a mine in 20 years, how long does it take right now to be able to permit one nuclear power plant? What's the number? Does anyone know right now if you're going to permit a nuclear power facility?
Certainly measured more than a decade. It's not, there's no one has managed to beat that record.
Dr. Hogan, you have a good guess on if someone wants to start a nuclear power plant, how long it takes before they can actually break ground right now in permitting?
I'm not going to hazard a guess, but I do think we have a next generation of nuclear plants for which the permitting issues will be more straightforward.
So it may be 8 years rather than 10? Well, again, we all need a guess because we're trying to figure out if we're planning for a net zero by 2035 or 2050, and it takes us 15 years to be able to put transmission lines up, 20 years to be able to do that. We are in the process of heading straight towards total dependency on China, and we can't actually get all this online. Again, I'm not an opponent to any of this. We've got to figure out what are realistic timelines on how we're going to handle the permitting and how to be able to solve that, or all this is good theory and we'll still be discussing it in 2060. Mr. Chairman, you'll yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator Cortez Masto. Oh, she's not there. We have Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find myself in the uncomfortable position of agreeing almost entirely with Senator Langford. When I was governor, I did a lot of work on environmental permitting in Maine. And what I said was, I want the highest environmental standards and the most timely and predictable permitting process. And quite often the problem is the process. It's not necessarily the standards. So I agree that I think that's something that we need to attend to. One thing that we did in Maine that perhaps we should be talking about here is one-stop shopping. You go to one agency that handles all the permitting, and they coordinate the activities of the other agencies. So I do think that this is something that we need to discuss because we are going to have to, as we go to move away from fossil fuels, which, by the way, is a kind of mining, to a different kind of mining, we're going to have to deal with this problem. We can't wish it away, and we can't just say, oh, we're going to build lots of windmills, which I used to do, by the way, or solar panels. But we've got to think about where these minerals are going to come from. And as Senator Langford pointed out, the pandemic taught us we should not be dependent upon our pacing adversary or potential adversary to supply minerals that are critical to the development of our economy. So I think that's an important point. Mr. French, I want to change the subject entirely. We had your boss, I'm not sure she's your boss, head of the Forest Service, Ms. Christensen, was here earlier this week.
She's my boss.
So, okay, some significant data came out in that hearing. In 1988, we harvested 13 billion board feet off of federal land in this country. Today, it's 3 billion. She testified that that dramatic cut in the harvesting of timber in our federal lands has contributed substantially to the fire problem. Do you agree with that?
What I would say
Remember,
is
she's
that,
your boss.
yeah, no, she and I talk about this and work on this all the time. The issue is to reduce wildland fire risk, we have to remove understories and small diameter trees from areas that have no value.
Which in Maine we call pre-commercial thinning.
Absolutely, we have to pay for that most of the time.
But that involves working the forests in a productive way in order to, if you have greater harvesting, you have more pre-commercial thinning because that makes the timber more valuable, and that lowers the fuel load on the floor of the forest. Is that correct?
In some places, yes.
But it's, will you confirm that this dramatic drop from 13 billion to 3 has contributed to the fire risk, along with, of course, climate change, drought, heat, and all of those elements?
Senator, it has been a contributing factor in some places, but not everywhere. So if you look in and around, let's say, Southern California and some of those forests there, which are non-commercial type areas, it's a very different scenario.
Well, and the grasslands that you testified, that's a separate issue, I understand. But I think we can't ignore this is one of these things, we can't ignore the fact that we're not clearing out the understory, and then we're going to have fires. Let me move on for a minute. Ms. Hogan, I found myself again in the uncomfortable position of agreeing with Mr. Mills. Research is critical, and I hope that in all of this practical application, we not neglect the importance of basic research. For example, I believe one of the greatest barriers to a carbon-free future is storage. It may be batteries, it may be molten salt, it may be other technologies, but if we can beat the storage problem to deal with the intermittency of solar and wind, that's a big deal, and research is where that needs to take place. So is that a commitment of your department?
It's a tremendous commitment of our department. We totally agree with you.
On the mining, I just want to touch quickly. I agree. I think recycling, Mr. Mayor, we've got to do a lot better job with that. We don't have to. We can mine our dumps instead of digging holes in the ground. There's a tremendous resource there. One place I do disagree with Mr. Mills is on. Well, I just want to raise a red flag about LNG exports. Two problems that I'm concerned about. One is effect on domestic prices. So we can't repeal the supply and demand. Even this committee can't do that. And as supply is distributed across the globe, it's taken away from domestic, and I'm just gravely worried about effect on domestic prices. Australia did a huge export step, and their domestic prices went through the roof. So that's concern number two is, it's true, and I've always been an advocate of natural gas as a transition fuel, that it does burn cleaner than coal, oil, and other fossil fuel alternatives. The problem is when you count the methane attributed to the extraction of natural gas actually comes out right equal with coal. And so if we don't deal with the methane issue that's connected with the transportation and mining of natural gas, we're not going to gain anything environmentally. That's a critical part of a clean energy future, and particularly a short-term clean energy future as we move to natural gas. But if that natural gas has the methane implicit content, we're not going to gain anything in terms of carbon and effect on the not carbon, but effect on the atmosphere, because as we all know, methane is about 80 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2. So this has to be something that we have to pay attention to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Marshall.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for holding this hearing. Certainly, there's lots of agreement here on our goals of leaving this world cleaner, healthier, safer, the goal of using more affordable, cleaner energy, the goal of taking traditional energies and making them cleaner. That's the great news, is we agree on these goals, and then the question is, how do we best get there? And I was interested by Dr. Eakin's comments about raising productivity. As we take Americans' taxpayer dollars and invest money, especially in infrastructure, we want to know, does it raise productivity? And as I've certainly never studied economy growing up or in school or much since then, but as I understand, GDP increases when we increase efficiencies. And if we're not going to increase the efficiency, we need to figure out what's the environment, what's the cost for making the environment cleaner, right? What's the return of that investment? As you look through the plan before us, was there any red flags that you were really concerned that the investment was not raising productivity and there wasn't much of an environmental impact, a return on investment, so to speak?
Well, certainly in the administration's American Jobs Plan, there are large amounts of resources committed to things that are unlikely to raise productivity. Schools, sending $300 or $400 billion on schools is not going to raise the productivity of the American worker. $400 billion on a Medicaid expansion.
Are you serious?
It will not.
Education?
No, I didn't say education. I said just the school buildings. The education's crucial, and I would concur with you on that, because we are failing America's youth. We have 25% to a third of 4th and 8th graders who cannot read at grade, and that's been true for 10 straight years. So do not label me as someone who doesn't think education is important, but we're not doing anything about that.
So I think more
We'll add that to your time, sir.
More specifically, as we invest in energy, were there some concerns here that it was not a good return on investment?
My major concern is that moving from a model where you rely on private investment in energy,
It's more efficient.
you get some natural efficiencies because risk capital is used in the process, and if you override that, you're unlikely to pick projects as successfully. That's less efficient.
Okay. My next question for Mr. French. Again, I'm not a forest person. We don't grow many trees in Kansas. But whenever I turn on the news, all the forest fires are in the western half of the country. The southeast certainly has forest as well. And I guess why are there hardly any major forests in southeast United States, but there's always more in the western half?
Thank you, Senator. Different ecosystems, but there is a lot of fire in the southeast. We've been able to maintain those through a lot of prescribed fire and through management. And so when you look at the crisis we have right now, we need to both continue to maintain those in the southern United States, and we need to thin and reduce the fuel loadings in those fire-adapted forests in the west to get them into a state that we can maintain them like we are in the south.
I mean, again, I guess my frustration is this is not rocket science.
No.
Though what you're describing is something that so you're saying the practices in the southeast have been successful because they've implemented them. There's no secrets what they're doing there. Why haven't we been implementing these in the past?
It's different. The topography is different. The resources haven't met the need. And the systems are different. The topography is different. They do burn differently. We've been excluding fires for the 110 years from those places. And we have not had prescribed fire or mechanical treatments in those places, so that now when we have fires, they're burning at levels we just haven't seen before.
And I guess I go back to the why. I feel like we can't see the forest for the trees, really. We're trying to conserve something, but in the end, without using the prescribed fire, it costs us more in the long run. Why have we just ignored this obvious solution?
Quite frankly, Senator, we haven't had the resources to carry out that work at the scale needed.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hickenlooper.
So this is the kind of lively panel that I've been waiting for, and I'm going to try and resist the temptation to fan any flames. First, Mr. Chair, I wanted to thank you for all the work on the infrastructure as you walk out the door. Well, he's doing the real work. Certainly they're the highest priority. Let me start with Dr. Hogan asking you a question here on the NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden. And the NREL's got a SEAM study I'm sure you've seen that the building more transmission between largely disconnected parts of the grid would pay for itself up to 3 times, and in so doing would provide immense benefit to those states that are energy rich in renewable energy but don't have the population centers to utilize that. Do you agree that building more high voltage transmission would unlock significant resource potential? And we've heard a lot about permitting, and I think that's a valid point. At a time when we got a COVID vaccine permitted in record time. We had a vaccine that was out, ready to go in 300 days. Perhaps this is the time to really have a bipartisan push on permitting improvement. What's your sense?
Well, thank you. And yes, the country would benefit from more high-voltage transmission lines for the reasons that you point out and are well put forth in the NREL-SEAM study. I think, there are a number of opportunities to move, as you say, energy from places that are energy rich to urban populations and to go across areas that are, where there's not too much activity going on. And you're absolutely right that being really thoughtful about the permitting and other people parts of these conversations is really important. I think that's really one of the sets of objectives that behind the American Jobs Plan proposal for a new grid development deployment authority at the Department of Energy, one where we could help have the Department of Energy be a much stronger coordinating force on a lot of these issues, as well as having access to some creative financing tools that can help leverage, not replace, private sector investment in transmission. Again, that's a big part of that is in the infrastructure discussion draft, but we would also love to talk about some additional improvements there.
I think you find a lot of support in the Senate for that. Ms. Trujillo, I wanted to ask, as you know, Western water resource development and management is somewhat unique. We have projects that serve agriculture, population centers, cities large and small, outdoor recreational economy. The $5 billion that's set aside in the discussion draft is a good start, but I'll add that many Western water providers in Colorado are urging that we do more. Do you agree that we need to prioritize additional infrastructure in terms of water storage?
Thank you very much, Senator. The issues in the West are very concerning. We are dealing with drought on a daily basis, and the provisions in the bill are a good start. They support many of the ongoing programs that we have in place to be able to address drought. We think we can include more programs such as Indian water rights settlements, rural water provisions, and dam safety. There's an all-hands-on-deck approach right now to our water supply issues.
Great, thank you. Mr. French, when you testified last week before the committee, you spoke at some length about the protections that could be afforded to Colorado lands through the Core Act. This week I'd like to shift focus from lands that need protecting to the lands that the Forest Service is trying to help recover from wildfires. I thought maybe you could speak a moment about the backlog of projects with respect to forest fire recovery, not just in Colorado, but across the West.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator. There's at least 63 million acres of our national forest system right now that are in need of a backlog of treatments that are in an extreme condition to produce wildfire. Our scientists show that if you want to reduce 80% of the risk to communities, there's about 20% of those acres that we need to treat. Those are the most critical spaces for us to be in. And in order to do that, we have to scale up our work by at least 2 to 4 times what we're doing right now. That's the backlog that we have to get up.
Right. It's prodigious. Great. Thank you all very much as a live. I have other questions I will submit in writing. I yield to the chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Us Westerners love these conversations, don't we, Governor?
We do.
All right. Clean and reliable water is fundamental to human life. The Montana delegation has worked for over a decade to adjust the cost share for the St. Mary's Milk River project so that much-needed reconstruction can take place. and any rural water package must ensure that folks on the high line of Montana get the help they need. This water system is over 100 years old and is one of the worst cost shares in the nation, which is what led to the collapse of a drop structure this past summer. You see behind me. It was a catastrophic failure, and that created huge problems for us. We rallied together and were able to get a fix put in place here and repaired by the end of the year, but it was tough. If Congress doesn't move quickly to pass my bill, we could find ourselves in the same situation yet again. Ms. Trujillo, can you speak to the infrastructure needs on the St. Mary's Milk River system and the risks posed by further inaction?
Thank you, Senator Deans. I turned my mic on the minute I saw that photo, and I knew the question was coming this way. So I appreciate your attention and prioritization of that issue. We are also very concerned. We worked well in the context of the prior emergency, and we're looking forward to providing testimony next week in the House on the provisions. But
thank you, and a thanks again how we came together truly.
Yep.
State, federal, local, just it was a great example of working together and getting a good result after the failure. I want to talk for a moment about forest management. Well, I'm glad that this bill in relationship to the infrastructure too funds much needed forest work. I believe strongly we haven't had the paradigm shift that Chief Christensen spoke about, in fact, when she was here. We need to include some what I call common sense management reforms. Region 1's litigation rate is higher than ever. And here's a startling statistic. 93% of these lawsuits are forest or fuel and vegetation management projects. The project could actually reduce the wildfire risk. I just got off a phone call before I came to this hearing about Montanans very concerned about what's going on with the outlook on this fire season, which has already begun. Half of the project area in the map behind me burned in wildfire while the project languished in the courts. Because of the threat of litigation, agencies are discouraged from streamlining NEPA based on past projects they know won't have significant environmental impact. A substantial time and cost savings could be achieved by litigation protections and streamlining these processes. 63 million acres are at high risk of wildfire at the moment. We have to do just that instead of just throwing more money at this problem. Mr. French, will this $5.5 billion be more effectively utilized if paired with my litigation protections and streamlining provisions, such as the efforts we are doing here to eliminate unnecessary consultation paperwork caused by the now infamous Cottonwood decision and to simplify environmental review for these collaboratively developed projects?
Thank you, Senator. If you look at our wildland fuel reduction projects and our broad-scale restoration projects, 2/3 of the effort and time that goes into those is usually through the environmental analysis, compliance, and design. An average project is going to take, at the quickest, 8 months to a year, and generally it's 2 years to 2.5 years to get us through the environmental compliance side of things before we can actually start to implement, with litigation that can stretch on for years after that. And yes, we have seen in many cases where projects that we had planned to reduce fire are overcome by fire before we can implement them as we go through those phases. I think any sort of collaborative, concerted effort that can help us do science-based, environmentally sound, and public-supported approaches to do this work more efficiently and effectively would make any investment like this better.
It's so true, and these are collaborative projects. These are projects that just make so much sense for the vast majority of Montanans, and we have a very small group here that litigate these that are out of touch with where most Montanans are. In fact, Mr. Chairman, just last week in this committee, I heard calls for management reforms on both sides of the aisle, and Chairman Manchin, thanks for your support in this area. I hope to keep working with you on forest management provisions in this bill. And as I wrap up, I want to tell you, Mr. Chairman, I was very encouraged by the language that you added that require agency review of these critical mineral permitting. It's a big deal. I do believe, as the chairman does, we need to take more robust steps to increase domestic critical mineral production in the United States. We're far too reliant on foreign countries, on the minerals that drive our economy, especially since nearly all of them can be found and mined in the United States. It should not take decades to permit a mine, Mr. Chairman, so thanks for your support on that.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panelists. Mr. Trujillo, let me start with you. I so appreciate Senator Hickenlooper's comments. As we're all aware, there's a historic drought happening in the West right now. Colorado River Basin is facing its worst hydrology on record, which could lead to its first ever shortage declaration this year. I so appreciate your comments. It's all hands on deck right now. Please let us know what the administration needs from us as well to address this issue. And I just want to put something on your radar. Right now, I'm working on a bill to establish a new competitive grant program under the Bureau of Reclamation for large-scale water recycling and reuse projects. A bill would also include measures that would provide greater clarity and expand eligibility under existing drought programs for eligible entities to receive federal financial assistance for drought planning and drought mitigation purposes. Look forward to working with you on that, so thank you. Let me jump back to conversation around critical minerals and battery recycling and manufacturing grants. Given all the exciting new technologies I see regularly in Nevada, I've been pushing what I call in my state the Innovation State Initiative. This has allowed me in Nevada to promote the companies and technologies that in some cases have helped my state weather the current economic and health challenges posed by COVID-19. But one of those new exciting areas is battery recycling of all sizes. And that's why I'm proud to be supporting Senator King's Battery and Critical Mineral Recycling Act. And I agree with Mr. O'Mara's written testimony that the entirety of that bill should be seriously considered for this package as well. I'm also working to put together a bipartisan effort on battery manufacturing grants, especially recycling, so we can be investing in a domestic supply chain and workforce that help us compete globally today and tomorrow. I've seen firsthand in Nevada where recycling is not only a future economic driver, but a necessity as we have more and more of the vehicle batteries on our roads and coming off of them. And I'm aware of industries in Alaska, Montana, Idaho, all over who could benefit from DOE grant funds to establish or retrofit facilities for this purpose. So let me start with Dr. Hogan and Mr. O'Mara. What are the broader implications of making investments in our domestic manufacturing capacity? And would you agree that we need to be making strides in this space for global competitiveness and national security reasons? And Dr. Hogan, I'll start with you.
Yes, we agree that the supply chain that go with our batteries is a critical place for us to be taking important steps so that that build out is happening in this country. As you've pointed out, it's a growth opportunity for states like Nevada, but really the whole country as we move toward a variety of battery technologies for electric vehicles and for the grid. So we absolutely agree that this is an important priority.
And thank you. And let me, Mr. O'Mara, I want your weigh in on this, but let's talk also about the critical minerals for these batteries as we talk about recycling, right? Lithium mining we are looking at in Nevada right now, but cobalt. And to my understanding, where is most of the cobalt being mined right now? Do either one of you know? Does anybody know? Mr. O'Mara?
Congo.
Yeah. And that's the challenge that we have in this country. And so if we are really going to identify these critical minerals, bring that supply chain back from the extraction through the production, through the whole process, we have to look at the mining piece of it as well. And so, Mr. O'Mara, if you could address this, I would appreciate it.
And I think Senator Langford said it well earlier. I mean, like, we've seen the problems when we don't have control over our supply chains. And, I'll be damned if we're going to spend the next 30 years buying everything from China or offshore wind turbines from Germany or electric vehicles from Japan when we could do that all here. And, like, there is an environmental piece of this. I mean, there's been a NIMBYism around a lot of this. We have to be smarter. There's also been GAO analyses that show that kind of incomplete permits are slowing down the process, and in some cases as much as kind of government inefficiency. But I think combining the work that you're trying to do, the work that Senator Manchin's been trying to do around advanced manufacturing and thinking about everything in between, it's the best way to create good paying jobs in every part of the country if we do it right.
That's right. And I know I've got just a few minutes left. Let me just touch on the rangeland fires because I also appreciate this conversation as well. Nevada, most of our fires are rangeland fires. We have cheatgrass everywhere. And we have been talking about trying to address this. This is an invasive species. For all of the reasons that I heard earlier, it's just not conducive or effective here in Nevada. So the goal here is how do we make sure that our federal agencies have the resources they need and the information they need to really address this invasive species and address what we see are the rangeland fires. Listen, we have forest fires, yes, but rangeland fires that I've seen in Nevada are some of the largest that we have ever seen, and they have an impact on individuals, and the economy, along with the climate as well. So, Mr. Amir, if you would touch on that very briefly, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, and just building on Dr. Holtz-Eakin's point, I mean, this is an area where, like, if we don't make investments, the downside on the economy, slowing down our GDP, is massive. I mean, and so, like, again, I mean, I think this is like collective defense. I mean, if we have to invest in our natural infrastructure as a way to reduce the risk to community, to life, to property, to businesses, and we need to do it at scale. I mean, the challenge is that it's always an afterthought. It's always treated as discretionary spending, but I would argue this is as important to our economic future as anything else we're talking about right now.
I agree. Thank you. Thank you to the panelists.
I have some second round questions. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Trujillo, water is the lifeblood of the West. Critical that Congress fund Western water infrastructure programs. As written, the bill before us today directs about $5 billion to the Bureau of Reclamation for water infrastructure. Does the bill impose any restrictions on how the Bureau can spend this money, or does the bill, give the Bureau the broad discretion?
Thank you, Senator Barrasso. The bill as drafted, as I understand, is a discussion draft, so it's an initial proposal that does give us broad authority in many of the categories that we already have on the books. So I presume we would use our existing authorities and the existing processes we have.
So can you speak about the importance of reauthorizing the expiring provisions of the WIN Act to address issues such as building more water storage?
Thank you, Senator. The WIN Act has several different provisions, and they are in various states of application, and some of them are expiring, some of them are continuing, and we're in the process of reviewing all of those with Congress as they may be reauthorized or may not.
So would you agree that the infrastructure package should include reauthorizing these that are expiring?
Some of the provisions would be appropriate for reauthorization.
Thanks. Mr. Mills? The bill before us today seeks to, quote, ensure that the United States has a viable battery materials processing industry to supply North American battery supply chain, expand the capabilities of the United States in advanced battery manufacturing, and enhance national security by reducing our reliance on China for critical materials and technologies. Is a federal grant program, no matter how large, sufficient to achieve these goals?
Senator, I think the short answer is no, and this is where I would like to say I feel it's a point of privilege, not uncomfortable, but comfortable in being in the same camp, it appears, as Senator King, with respect to regulations and the relevance here. I think it is possible to, I am not in the position to clarify being anti-regulation. In fact, most businesses will tell you, in particular miners, they embrace regulations. They want consistency. They understand the goals. They embrace the goals. It's the process, and it is out of control, and it is damaging America. And I don't oppose more wind turbines or more electric cars. I think we'll have lots more of them. We should have lots more of them. The challenge is the process of that, and we won't get to our goals that are being laid out in many of these plans by using American resources and labor. We'll be importing a lot more material, and I don't see a path out here yet. I will just repeat again. I embrace the concepts of smart regulation with clear deadlines and a participation in a process that allows a private market to invest here. Private markets have made the decision to invest elsewhere, and they're doing it epically in very challenged areas in Africa and in South America.
So do we need to add language to the draft bill to meaningfully increase American mining?
I like the word meaningfully. I agree entirely. Yes, sir.
So the bill before us today includes a $5 billion program that appears, in my opinion, designed to bail out the state of California and its failing electric grid. Now, I would note that the state of California has an unprecedented budget surplus of $75 billion. Will a new federal grant program for the benefit of the state of California and its electric utilities actually keep the lights on in California?
I doubt it, Senator, but I guess I would make the point that I'm not clear why the American taxpayer should fund California's won't call them mistakes, they're experiments. We have this, our states have grand experiments that are underway in many respects in the energy markets. This is a good thing. I'm not sure why we should fund it with taxpayer money.
And in your testimony, you identify the most cost-effective ways for the U.S. to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Your list includes facilitating the construction of natural gas pipelines, liquefied natural gas export terminals here in the country. Your list also includes encouraging the development of more efficient internal combustion engines. Do you see anything in this bill to encourage the construction of natural gas pipelines, liquefied natural gas terminals, or more efficient internal combustion engines?
Well, first I'll confess I may have missed it if it's there, but it wasn't in evidence to me, and I just want to emphasize the cost efficiency metric of looking for ways to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, I think should be paramount.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kelly, you are next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I commend Senator Manchin and any additional members of this committee for embarking on this process to develop a bipartisan infrastructure proposal. The draft bill recognizes the urgent need to respond to the crushing drought, rolling brownouts, and wildfires engulfing the West. Mr. Chairman, I'll state at the outset that I look forward to working with the committee to build out the $5 billion Western water infrastructure provision. Most of the dams, reservoirs, and irrigation canals that store and transport water to farms and cities in western states are more than 50 years old, and they're failing, and they're wasting water, a resource that we do not have enough of. You know, funding should be prioritized for the completion of authorized water storage projects, deferred maintenance for dams, and the recently established aging infrastructure account at the Bureau of Reclamation. Rural water, Title 16 water recycling and desalination programs are also a must. Conservation programs and water smart grants to promote water efficiency, including lining canals, must not be overlooked either. I also appreciate the inclusion of a proposal that I authored to promote grid resiliency through the use of demand response technology. Extreme heat waves and polar blasts in some places can lead to surging demand for electricity that exceeds supply. The widespread deployment of network smart appliances and batteries can help states keep their lights on during these peak periods. We saw the success of this in Arizona just last summer when smart thermostat programs were able to reduce the strain on the grid by significantly dropping the load. Big success story. And finally, the draft bill recognizes that our national forests are infrastructure too. Forest watersheds funnel snow melt into our rivers and lakes, but megafires, which are raging at this very moment, got the worst fire season on record. They have devastating and long-term impact on rural communities and water supplies. So my first question is for Mr. Hio, and it's about water. The Interior Department is expected to declare its first ever water shortage on the Colorado River very soon, and reclamation is part of an interstate agreement called the Drought Contingency Plan that involves adding 100,000 acre-feet of water to Lake Mead to avoid even steeper water curtailments. So, Mr. Hio, what infrastructure will reclamation need to meet this obligation?
Thank you very much, Senator Kelly. It is no surprise that we are very much focused on trying to address the issues in the Colorado River Basin. The infrastructure needs we have can include well modernization, funding for system conservation projects, funding for support for tribal system conservation programs, and additional relief that will help build to what the other parties are working on as well.
Does any part of that include additional funding for dams to increase capacity?
Yes, Senator, there will be additional funding for increased storage. We also have, excuse me, funding for recycling projects, and Senator Cortez Masto referenced an innovative project that involves large-scale recycling that can be beneficial to Colorado River Basin states and local communities in the area.
And on the WIN Act, would you agree that the WIN Act, which expires this year, would you agree that that helps reclamation manage against drought?
Thank you, Senator Kelly. The WIN Act has several different provisions, and some of them are definitely helpful with respect to our drought response efforts.
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, in the remainder of time, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but what is the department's position on my provision to expand demand response programs to all federal buildings and in DOE energy efficiency grants to states?
We're very supportive of using the demand response tool as a cost-effective way to contribute to the energy grid. We all know that the last kilowatt that's provided can be an expensive kilowatt, and this is a way to get there more cheaply. And we also believe that sending energy efficiency-related dollars that are good investments in energy efficiency are a good way to lower costs and put dollars that would otherwise be used to pay bills to better purposes.
Thank you, Dr. Hogan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hoven.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hogan, Dr. Faith Birol, head of the International Energy Agency, has told this committee that carbon capture and utilization technology is, quote, the most important technology that exists today, end quote. Do you agree that carbon capture and storage is vitally important to meeting our climate goals?
Yes, we have had a long program in carbon capture and utilization and storage, and expect to continue to be working aggressively on that to reduce its costs throughout that entire chain.
Yeah, and isn't it important that we, in essence, crack the code on it? Because it's not just about what we do here in America, it's around the world, right? There's other parts of the country that or the world that are emitting a lot of CO2, and if we don't develop that technology and make it commercially viable, then we're not really addressing the problem from a global standpoint, are we?
We agree that this is an important technology that will have a growth market associated with it, and we want the United States to be there on the leading edge with being able to benefit from this technology in many ways, economically as well as what it can do for carbon.
And isn't it also true that it's not just about fossil fuels, but that it also relates to things like, for example, biofuels, where we strip the CO2 and sequester? We're working on that in my state, as well as for our manufacturing industry.
Absolutely.
Does DOE stand ready to assist energy producers and manufacturers in meeting their goals to retrofit their operations because of the investment required?
We stand, yes, we would be ready to provide any assistance given the authority and resources to do it.
So it's safe to say you're committed to making it happen?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Trujillo, so the proposal being discussed today, which has many good aspects to it, would appropriate $5 billion in FY22 through FY26 for Western water infrastructure. And I know the ranking member thinks that most of that should go to his state, but the acting chairman and I and some others are hoping that we'll get a little bit of it as well. So tell me, what type of projects would be eligible for that funding, proposed funding in the draft legislation?
I would note for the record that Ms. Trujillo is from the state that really needs it.
Thank you all. Thank you sincerely, all the members of the committee, for recognizing the severity of the drought and the importance of trying to address the drought concerns. We work on it every day. The provisions in the draft are under discussion or for discussion, and they provide additional funding to many of the programs that we already have on the books. So we would utilize our existing authorities and our existing criteria to provide to use those programs.
Well, that's what I kind of want to drill in on a little bit, is how do you determine the allocation? Because I think it's going to be it's a very good provision. It's going to be very much sought after. So how do you kind of make that decision in terms of what projects you fund and in what priority order?
Thank you, Senator. The answer kind of depends on which program we're talking about. There are criteria that are in place for each of the various authorities. In the rural water context, for example, reclamation utilizes criteria to determine which programs should receive which funding depending on how far along they are, depending on the urgency of the needs. There are several different factors that we would be working with.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm going to do a quick second round, and then I know Senator King has a second round question as well. Assistant Secretary Trujillo, talk a little bit just about the role that climate change, what impact is that having on your ability to manage water west-wide?
Thank you, Senator Heinrich. The reality is we're seeing higher temperatures, which in and of itself creates a dynamic situation for drier soils and more evaporation. So our runoff numbers aren't what they used to be, frankly. In addition, we see more variable snowpacks. We see rain instead of snow in some cases, which causes many complex challenges for what we used to see in terms of our reservoir supplies. So there's a number of ways that the changing climate makes our world more difficult. And
does any of it make your world, your daily water management easier?
Well, it's keeps me up at night for sure. But I think the reality is we have to be creative with all of the tools that we have available.
Talk about that. Talk a little bit about the whole suite of tools that we should be investing in now that are maybe different than just, if you don't have water, more storage does not get you more storage if you don't have the fundamental water. So you talked a little bit about recycling. People I know are now looking at underground storage. We've done a little bit of that in New Mexico. I've seen it in California as well. What's the whole suite of tools that we should be embracing given the world that we live in today?
Thank you very much. I was going to bring up the example of our home state in Albuquerque where we have conjunctive management of our surface water and groundwater. So what we see this year, the surface water is very, very low. So the city has converted to utilizing its groundwater resources, and that may be an example. I was speaking with Senator Cantwell earlier. That may be an example of something to expand in other areas. Water recycling capabilities need to be expanded, and we can promote that through these large-scale projects or small-scale projects. The ability to try to utilize as many tools as we have available is what we need to do, ultimately promoting more efficient use and more conservation.
Mr. French, I want to ask a related question. How much should we be paying our entry-level firefighters? And clearly, it's not 11, it's not 13. What should we be paying them?
Well, I think clearly enough to support a family and to compensate the risks that they take on behalf of the entire American public.
And enough to attract someone that want to do this job in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we're training firefighters at an entry level and then losing them to other firefighting organizations because they're paying double or triple amount by the time we've trained them.
What's the delta between what you're paying and what CAL FIRE saves?
Almost 3 times at times.
Yeah. I have 2 minutes left on the clock, Mr. Ranking Member. Is it okay if I yield my last minute 45 to Senator King?
Or as much time as you'd like.
There we go. Fantastic. Take it away, Angus.
Thank you. I just want to compliment the ranking member and Senator Manchin and the staff for putting together this panel. This has been the kind of discussion that we should be having at congressional hearings with a variety of points of view, a variety of points of expertise, and I think it's been a very productive session, very helpful to me. I just wanted to make a final point. A theme underlying our discussion today has been the role of public investment versus private investment. And there's no question private investment is what generally drives our economy. It's created the richest nation in the history of the world, and that's the major focus. On the other hand, there's no question that public investment has a role to play, and I wanted to share with you an insight from some time ago. Here's what it says. Time and experience have verified to a demonstration the public utility of internal improvements, in other words, infrastructure, that the poorest and most thinly populated counties would be greatly benefited by the opening of good roads and in the clearing of navigable streams within their limits is what no person will deny. That was the very first political brochure written by Abraham Lincoln at the age of 23 when he ran for the legislature in Illinois in 1832. And my addition to that would be, although private investment has driven this economy, I would argue that the two most important economic development infrastructure investments of the 20th century were the GI Bill and the interstate highway system, both public investments which changed the face of the country. I'm in a state which, if the interstate highway system had been strictly built on population or economic return, Interstate 95 would probably stop at Boston. And yet it's been critical to the economic development of my state. So I commend our panel today, and I think what we are striving to do here is to achieve the proper balance between incentives, proper incentives for efficient investment of private capital, at the same time providing public investment in the image of the interstate highway system or the GI Bill, which can contribute in very significant ways to the development of the country, controlling of climate change, and economic development that's shared among all of our citizens. So again, I want to thank our panel and thank our chair and ranking member for, I think, a very productive hearing.
Thank you, and with that, the hearing is closed.